Welcome to today's Thursday video where I point out the mistake I mentioned a couple of days ago, which was shaving my hair without realizing we are in January. We are with about 2 degrees outside and I like to keep my windows open when I'm not bothering to make a video, which makes the back of my head get farmed by cold air non-stop, which is something I didn't think about when I was shaving my hair. Anyways, I guess I have to suffer with these consequences. For today, we are lighting a candle to the unseen, the forgotten, the underappreciated. We are talking about the overall worst specs of this expansion. I'm talking about looking through Season 1, Season 2 and Season 3, and then looking at the popularity and the presence and the performance of the specs throughout each season, whether it was the Raid or Mythic Plus, and just pick the few ones that overall did the worst. Maybe they were underappreciated, maybe they were just not believed in by the community, but all in all the result was the same. The result was that they didn't get a lot of time to shine throughout the expansion. I think this is a cool concept to go through because nowadays we just keep talking about who is flavor of the month, who is meta, who is part of the high keys in Mythic Plus or the top DPS in the raid. So we keep mentioning the same specs, Havoc, and then Rogues, and Mages, and Demo Warlock, Vengeance Demon Hunter, Discipline Priest, but what about the specs that don't get talked about as often? The specs that are in the shadows more often. Starting from our shortest category, which is the tank category, this one could have barely even had one entry. If we had to pick one standout though, it would have to be Protection Warrior. Now, if we go through the meta of the expansion when it comes to Mythic Plus, we can see, of course, that Protection Warrior is not really there this season. We can also see that in Season 2, Protection Warrior was not really there, and it was only present in the first part, in the first basically 2.5 months or so of Season 1. Before, more and more players started picking up on Prot, and then Prot was giga-buffed, and it became very, very meta until then Season 2 began, Guardian became part of the Exodia, and then Prot also got the BTFO treatment. But before that, overall, Prot Warrior was basically meta in Mythic Plus for only 2.5 months, before disappearing from Mythic Plus. Now, you do see here that if there is one spec that did even worse, it's Brewmaster. Brewmaster has been even less present because, unlike Prot, they didn't even have one month, a couple of months maybe, of popularity in Mythic Plus. The main difference though between the two is that Brewmaster has remained and has continued to be a staple comfort pick for tanks when it comes to the raid. So throughout the seasons, whether it was 1, 2 or 3, Brewmaster kept being played as opposed to Protection Warrior, which was again only present in the first few months of Season 1. So overall, Warrior was the worst pick of tanks for the entirety of the expansion so far. It continues to have more or less the same problems it has had for a while, which is that they are weaker in terms of self-sustain, in terms of keeping themselves alive. They're also weaker to most of the non-blockable, non-physical damage, dots, damage over times, bleeds, things that they have a much harder time dealing with as a tank compared to others. And their damage also has been very weak in Season 1 and Season 2. It has gotten somewhat better this season, but still nothing to write home about and still weaker than most of the other tanks. So they have kept these weaknesses more or less for the entirety of the expansion, which is perhaps sad, of course, to see that Blizzard has not been able to sort of reverse the trend of Prot Warrior throughout this expansion. They also have some slightly minor added weaknesses in Mythic Plus, like right now they can't deal with Incorporeal, they can't deal with Afflicted, they don't bring Bloodlust, they don't bring a Battle Rest, so they have even extra hurdles to go by if they wanted to make it in a popular Mythic Plus composition as a tank. The question about healers, on the other hand, is perhaps a bit more complex. It's more complex because, as you can see, there is some zigzagging back and forth, up and down throughout the season on who was the top pick. Because, for example, of course, in Season 2, Holy Paladin was the big pick in the Mythic Plus meta. But before 10.1.5 began, for the first couple of months, it was Resto Shaman. And by the end of Season 1, it was also Resto Shaman. And before that part of Season 1, it was Preservation Evoker with Resto Druid. And then Resto disappeared for an entire season only to come back again in the last season of the expansion. And now it is joined by Mistweaver and is joined by Discipline. So it does look like throughout the expansion, most of the healers had at least months to shine. 4 or 5 months, maybe even half a year worth of time to shine in the spotlight. With one exception, which is of course Holy Priest. However, that's why things get a bit mixed. The time to shine of Holy Priest wasn't in Mythic Plus, it was in the raid. The time of Season 1 and Season 2, where Holy Priest was the most brought, the most used, even in the world first level of progression, it was the strongest healer. Because of the power, not just of power infusion to do extra damage to your group, but also because of incredibly overpowered things like Symbol of Hope, giving you even more defensives. One Symbol of Hope from a Holy Priest has more value than something like a barrier from a Discipline Priest, just off of the amount of damage reduction you can gain from the personal cooldowns that Symbol of Hope allowed you to gain back. So even though it's true that Holy Priest wasn't available when it came to Mythic Plus in terms of being very meta, the popularity shifted into the raid. So if you really had to make the average of when were they popular and strong in 3 different seasons and 2 different activities, Raid and Mythic Plus, the one who in the end loses out the most has been Restoration Shaman. Because in general, Resto Shaman, while they were only meta for like 3 months or so, and on top of that, it was always brief. It was only, by the very end of the season, which is like whatever, and then only for the first couple of months of the next season, which nobody will remember because everyone will remember Season 2 as this bit right here. Definitely not at the start. So what makes it even worse then is the fact that in the raid, Resto Shaman was also not doing well. You only had plenty of players trying to quickly reroll to Resto Shaman before the release of Season 2 because they thought it was going to be OP, only to be gaslit as soon as Resto Shaman got their hands on their tier set and started getting outscaled by pretty much every other healer. So overall, the power of Resto Shaman has been the weakest throughout this expansion. Which is funny talking about it right now because at the moment Resto Shaman has one of the highest HPS in the raid in terms of performance, but their weakness still shows a little bit more in Mythic Plus. Their damage is still very low in Mythic Plus. The ability to use externals and powerful cooldowns on the tank or on a single player to save them is almost non-existent. They would have to dump an entire Spirit Link totem to be able to save them. Their quick, super fast spot healing is nowhere near the spot healing of something like a Holy Priest Serenity or even a Mistweaver Monk. So their weakness has remained in Mythic Plus for most of the expansion. So if you really had to pick one of the weakest of the healers throughout the season for both Mythic Plus and the raid, it would have to be Resto Shaman. Obviously, right before the beginning of Season 3, the answer was 100% Mistweaver. But in this season, Mistweaver is doing great, so they leapfrogged past Resto Shaman and left them at last for this expansion. Moving on to the ranged DPS. This is of course a special case because we have an extra. We have an intruder coming in mid-expansion, which is Augmentation Evoker. Obviously, in classic Blizzard fashion, the newly released thing is super OP, so they are definitely not amongst the specs that were the worst in this expansion. What is also funny though is that they might put their brother Devastation as one of the worst in this expansion, just because of the presence of Augmentation. Before Augmentation was a thing, Devastation was okay, it wasn't doing great. The release of the spec in Season 1 made them still terrible in Mythic Plus, also helped by the fact that Preservation was the meta pick, so you weren't running double Evoker in Mythic Plus. But at the start of Season 2, even more so with fewer and fewer Preservation Evokers, Devastation seemed to have some room to shine. Their burst damage was quite strong around their cooldown, and then Augmentation came out and Devastation just poofed in the air into nothingness. Which is why they are one of the candidates for the worst specs when it comes to range DPS in this expansion. It's not nearly as much their fault though. This is worth pointing out, unlike some other specs we might mention, this has more to do with the existence of Augmentation. Both in the raid and in Mythic Plus, that's what made Devastation suffer the most. We have to talk about, though, someone that didn't get squished by their class brother, instead they were just terrible by themselves, which is Elemental. So, Elemental Shaman for the range DPS not only was basically never present in Mythic Plus. If you see a blue line in Mythic Plus, the big one is obviously Enhancement, not Elemental. What's worse is that they didn't have a safe haven in the raid like for example Holy Priest being terrible in Mythic Plus, but at least they can chill, having a nice time in the raid. That wasn't even the case for Elemental. Elemental was straight up bad in both Mythic Plus and the raid. They continue to have the same shaman problems of previous expansions, which is no mandatory buff, no mandatory raid buff, party buff, some sort of cooldowns that they might bring. Your damage profile is weak. How drastic you are in trying to go all out in single target, losing tons of AoE damage, or trying to go for full AoE, losing tons of single target. On top of that, you also are squishy. You also have little defensiveness. You're just made of paper. So all of these things combined have contributed to Elemental Shaman being overall the worst range DPS in the expansion. This is worth mentioning because it's nice to point this out at Blizzard. You know, you had one expansion worth of time to figure out something, to figure out how to fix the spec, give them something special, something extra, or buff them up to the same level of one of your favorite special children like Fire Mage, like you happen to do every single expansion, making them strong. You should have done that as well to Elemental, which just didn't happen this expansion whatsoever. The spec is awful. However, I don't want to leave Elemental up in there alone, and I don't even want to keep them in a table for two next to Devastation. Because you know what's missing from Elemental and from Devastation? What's missing is the third male armor class in the game. So let's just make marksmanship join the table. So we are now done with unearthing what is at this point clearly racism, or I should say armorism, in Blizzard, clearly discriminating against male users, because not only we have Resto Shaman as the overall worst healer, now we also have the trio, the combo of Elemental plus Devastation plus Marksmanship as the worst ranged DPS. Marksmanship had a similar trajectory of Elemental, except even more depressing because some players had even some hope. They even thought for like a month that Marksmanship was going to be okay in Mythic Plus, and then they were quickly reminded they would have not been okay for the remainder of the expansion. In the raid, it wasn't going that much better either. The expansion started 1 month in, Marksmanship might even look like a top half spec in performance in Vault of the Incarnates, and then by the time you got into Season 2, you didn't even have the lie of the first few weeks to bait Marksmanship hunters into believing they are good. They were just straight up terrible from the get-go in Aberrus. So when it comes to Mythic Plus, they have been poor. When it comes to the raid, they have been even worse. So it's another candidate for being one of the weakest specs in this expansion. Marksmanship, to be fair, has been done quite dirty by Blizzard. They, for a long time, had similar weaknesses as Beastmastery Hunter. They were locked in their AoE damage, limited to 5 or so targets, and then they unleashed the AoE-ness on Beastmastery Hunter, on Beastcleave and Stomp, and the amount of wide AoE damage they could do, while still cucking Marksmanship in staying a much smaller number related AoE damage that they currently have. And on top of that, it's not that they have been some kind of specialist in single target, which is something Beastmastery actually was and turned out to for parts of this expansion. Marksmanship never even got to be that in this Dragonflight expansion in any point of this of the seasons. We then of course have all of the other weaknesses that hunters continue to have, like no utility, no raid buffs, no party buffs or debuffs that are required in a group or in a raid, and they also are, just to stay in line with the armorism and the discrimination from Blizzard against male users, they are the squishiest of the DPS, together with Elemental, together with Devastation. All of the male users happy together in being made of paper. That also hasn't changed in the entirety of this expansion. The last of our roles then is the melee. The melee, we have a flimsy podium in the second and third place, because in second you have Warrior and in third you have DK. All of the specs, Fury and Arms, and then Unholy and Frost, for very similar reasons, but not nearly as terrible, not nearly as badly bad as the specs we just mentioned for the DPS, because again, throughout the season, throughout the expansion, they have been weak. You know, in Mythic Plus, if you look at the presence, if you look at the appearance of these specs when it comes to DK and Warrior, they have been drastically underplayed throughout the season. Never Was there a single point where one of them was flavor of the month or just a must-have? At a point, for just a few weeks before Exodia hit the deck on Season 2, Fury was somewhat played, still not even in the top 5 played specs, but it was still at least a decent one in Mythic Plus, but only lasted for a short bit. So across all of Mythic Plus for well over a year, they have been overall all poor. In the raid is where things go slightly better, because they have been, at times, in certain points of the expansion, in different seasons, decent, especially Unholy, DK, and Arms Warrior. Both of them in the raid had some windows, some room where they were actually strong picks. Unholy was, your main standard power infusion pick for massive burst damage in single target. That was a very strong moment for Unholy in the expansion. So they are all in the podium, but it's a flimsy podium. It's not nearly as bad of an expansion for these specs, which still have problem, of course. Both of these classes we mentioned have very poor utility in terms of Mythic Plus, what they can bring in Mythic Plus. They are, for example, handicapped when dealing with Afflicted or when dealing with Incorporeal. They have also quite a few of them, whether it is Frost DK or Fury Warrior. They have a massive reliance on keeping up on the uptime, on damage on the enemies. Losing uptime and having to stop and pull a new Mythic Plus pack, for example, hurts them way more than another spec that can just go 0 to 100 immediately, like Havoc or like Outlaw, for example. They had some issues like widespread tons of AoE damage. This has been a problem of Arms Warrior, for example, since basically forever. Fury, on the other hand, had the opposite problem, which was they do great in consistent AoE damage over and over and over, but with weak single target. These are all things that remained throughout this expansion, and Blizzard hasn't really changed the status quo of any of these specs. They attempted the change to Unholy by changing the power of their cooldowns, giving them a more stable and consistent type of damage by also increasing their consistent AoE damage, but it hasn't really had many positive results, especially where you would like to have seen more consistent AoE damage work, which is Mythic Plus. Unholy hasn't really gotten much of any presence in high Mythic Plus keys. As I said, second and third place are flimsy positions, because at number 1 you have the undisputed victor of this expansion in terms of terribleness, which is Survival. As we know, this was a pact with the devil from Survival players. They had to pay their meta state of Season 3 and 4 of Shadowlands and the crimes they committed in that period by becoming irrelevant in this expansion. No surprise, throughout this entire expansion, they had no presence in Mythic Plus whatsoever, and the performance in the raid has been overall, all throughout, mediocre. We can say, though, that quite a decent amount of the ignoring of the performance of Survival has to do mostly with their popularity. Because while they are very underplayed in Mythic Plus, their performance continue to be top tier, top half, top 10 of performance. This is, for example, Survival in Mythic Plus up to last week. You wouldn't think that a spec that matches Enhancement or Balance or even beats Frostmage or Subtlety Rogue would be this unpopular then as a result in Mythic Plus, if they are doing that well in terms of sheer numbers. Same can be said in the raid. Even though they are not a top flavor of the month spec, their single target damage in raid encounters matches the one of a Havoc Demon Hunter and even beats the single target damage of a Ret Paladin. So the question is, why are Havoc and Ret this popular and Survival is here, right? In their case, even though they have been at the podium of the shittiest spec of the expansion, perhaps it might have to do more with the community perception of the spec and just not really valuing it too much, especially if you then add that Survival, despite doing well, still has the same problem of Hunter. They bring no raid buff, no party buff, no mandatory thing, no boss or enemy debuff that you want to have, zero utility, and they remain squishy, although much tankier than Marksmanship and Beast Mastery. So overall, in your raid, you don't want to make room for them when you could just bring another melee that can bring you a raid buff or a party buff, like, say, Wind Fury Totem, and same goes for Mythic Plus. You might want something that can deal better with certain mechanics or more defensiveness or perhaps more utility, which is something they don't have. And they are also very unpopular, so not many players care about them. That is perhaps maybe why they have suffered more in terms of popularity, in terms of how they have been showing up in the meta compared to their actual performance, which is not nearly as bad as their presence would suggest. So if we had to make the overall list of the most terriblest specs in this expansion throughout all 3 seasons, these are what we would have to sadly point out. I just wanted them to, to highlight them now, just so that as we start entering the process of the developing of the alpha and the beta of the war within, we might keep an eye out on for these specs, as they are the worst of this expansion, to see what Blizzard does to address some or many of their weaknesses, to see if some of their problems get fixed as we get into the next expansion. So for now, all we can do is just light a candle and weep for their state in this expansion. As I prepare myself to do that, I'm going to leave you to the rest of your Thursday. We're starting, as usual, the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can always be done completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, man, even with a closed window, I kind of feel some whiffs of 1 degree air in my head. What a mistake.